battle. Their target? The legendary city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Victory seems certain. After all, the Kievan Rus have conquered cities before. Armed with fearsome warriors and lightning-fast ships, they expect a swift and glorious raid. But within moments, the sea itself erupts into flames. Fire rains down from Byzantine ships, clinging to the water, spreading like a living creature. The Viking longships, built for speed but made of dry, flammable wood, ignite instantly. Panic takes over as warriors try to escape. Some jump into the water, only to realize the fire burns even on the sea's surface. The question is, what kind of weapon can turn the tide of battle so quickly? And how did this devastating defeat change history forever? The Kievan Rus were no ordinary invaders. They were descendants of the Vikings, fierce warriors who had sailed from Scandinavia, conquering lands and forging a vast trade empire along the rivers of Eastern Europe. In 941 AD, under the rule of Prince Igor of Kiev, they had become a powerful force, feared by both their neighbors and the mighty Byzantine Empire itself. At the heart of their power was the Viking longship, a marvel of naval engineering, fast, agile, and capable of navigating both open seas and narrow rivers. These ships allowed the Rus to strike swiftly, raiding cities and disappearing before an enemy could react. Their hit-and-run tactics had worked for decades, allowing them to plunder rich cities and build a thriving trade network. So when Igor set his sights on Constantinople, the Kievan Rus were confident. They had numbers, experience, and the element of surprise. What could possibly go wrong? If the Kievan Rus were powerful, the Byzantine Empire was legendary. At its heart stood Constantinople, a city unlike any other in the medieval world. Protected by massive stone walls, a formidable navy, and a wealth beyond imagination, it was the most coveted prize in Europe and Asia. For centuries, the Byzantines had repelled invaders, from the Persians to the Arabs, thanks to their advanced military tactics and superior technology. Their empire controlled vast trade routes, bringing in silk, spices, and gold from distant lands. But Constantinople's greatest defense wasn't its walls or its wealth. It was its navy. The Byzantine fleet ruled the seas with war galleys, specialized for battle. And hidden aboard those ships was a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. A weapon that could turn fire into a force of destruction. The Rus were about to learn this the hard way. The Kievan Rus' fleet arrived in the waters near Constantinople, expecting an easy victory. After all, the Byzantines seemed unprepared and outnumbered. Confident in their strength, the Rus' longships rushed forward, eager to plunder the legendary city. Then, without warning, the sea turned into an inferno. Byzantine warships, smaller and fewer in number, suddenly unleashed their secret weapon, Greek fire. From long bronze tubes mounted on their decks, the Byzantines spewed streams of liquid fire, igniting everything in its path. Panic erupted. The flames clung to wood, sails, and even the water itself, spreading uncontrollably. Desperate Rus' warriors jumped overboard, only to realize the fire floated and burned, even on water. Their once mighty fleet became a chaotic, burning graveyard. Within moments, what had seemed like an easy conquest had turned into one of the most horrifying naval disasters in Viking history. What exactly was Greek fire? How could a weapon from the 10th century cause such devastating destruction? Unlike normal fire, Greek fire couldn't be extinguished with water. In fact, it burned even more fiercely upon contact with it. Some accounts describe it as a liquid fire, capable of sticking to ships, armor, and even human skin. The Byzantines deployed it through siphon-like flamethrowers mounted on their warships, allowing them to unleash continuous streams of blazing destruction. The exact formula remains a mystery to this day. Historians speculate it may have contained petroleum, sulfur, and quicklime, creating a deadly chemical reaction. But whatever its ingredients, Greek fire was a game-changer. It not only saved Constantinople from the Rus in 941 AD, but it also cemented Byzantine naval superiority for centuries. For the Kievan Rus, this battle was a brutal lesson, one they wouldn't forget. The battle was over almost as quickly as it began. The once mighty Rus fleet lay in ruins, its charred remains drifting in the waters of the Black Sea. Survivors fled in terror, rowing desperately away from the inferno. Prince Igor of Kiev had underestimated the Byzantine defenses, and he paid the price. The Kievan Rus had expected gold and glory, but instead they suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in their history. Thousands of warriors perished, and the few who escaped returned home in disgrace. The Byzantines had proven that, despite their declining power, they still had weapons capable of annihilating entire fleets. This disastrous campaign forced Igor to rethink his strategy. He would not attack Constantinople again in the same reckless manner. But would he give up? Or would the Rus return with a new plan? The answer would come just a few years later. Prince Igor of Kiev was not the type to accept defeat easily. After the disaster of 941 AD, he rebuilt his fleet and returned to attack the Byzantines in 944 AD. But this time something was different. Rather than rushing into battle, Igor chose a diplomatic approach. The Byzantines, wary of another conflict, agreed to negotiate peace. The result? A new trade treaty between the Kievan Rus and the Byzantine Empire, granting them valuable commercial rights in Constantinople. It was a stunning reversal of fate. What began as a fiery disaster in 941 ultimately led to stronger ties between the two powers. The Rus had learned that brute force alone would not conquer Byzantium, but alliances and trade could make them even richer than war ever could. From this moment on, the relationship between the two civilizations would never be the same again.
Cabin, dirt floor, candlelight, and the Bible. No riches, no name, just a boy with a heart full of questions and a mind that would not sleep. I walked miles for books. I split rails by day and read law by firelight. I rose not from privilege, but from purpose. I saw a nation tearing at its own seams, brother against brother, white against black, liberty against chains. I took office when the Union was breaking. I did not seek war, but I would not allow America to break in two. I wore the weight of 600,000 souls lost. I listened to mothers weep and fields fall silent, but I held the line. We held the line. With one proclamation, I shattered the chains of millions. I did not end slavery alone, but I struck the blow that history could never unring. I walked the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg and said, "A government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." They called me tyrant, they called me savior, they called me honest, but I was only a man who believed that this nation, under God, could rise from its darkest hour. I was struck down in the hour of peace, but not before the Union was saved and freedom had a new birth. I am Abraham Lincoln, 16th President, defender of the Union, emancipator of the enslaved. America did not die on my watch, and so long as the people remember, it never shall.
In its place, they built something new, a republic, a government not ruled by a king, but by the people. Rome's republic was unlike anything the world had seen. At its core was the Senate, a council of Rome's elite guiding the state. At the head were two consuls, powerful leaders elected each year, balancing authority. But power was not equally shared. Rome was divided into two classes: the patricians, the wealthy aristocrats who controlled the government; the plebeians, the common citizens, farmers, soldiers, merchants, who fought for a voice in politics. Over time, the plebeians gained rights, securing their own representatives, the tribunes, who could veto unjust laws. But Rome's true strength did not come from its politics. It came from its legions. The Romans were warriors by nature. They expanded not just for land, but for glory and survival. In the 3rd century BCE, Rome clashed with Carthage, a powerful North African rival, in a series of wars that would define its future. The Punic Wars were brutal. The Carthaginian general Hannibal led his armies across the Alps, striking fear into the heart of Rome. But Rome was relentless. After years of struggle, the Romans defeated Carthage, razing it to the ground, enslaving its people, and salting its fields so that nothing would grow again. Victory made Rome the undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean. But conquest came at a cost. The more land Rome acquired, the harder it became to govern. With wealth pouring in from Greece, Egypt, and Spain, corruption spread. The Republic was cracking, and ambitious men saw opportunity. By the 1st century BCE, Rome was no longer a republic in spirit. Power was concentrated in the hands of a few, and the Senate was plagued by division. Then came Julius Caesar, a brilliant general, a masterful politician. Caesar won the love of the Roman people through his military conquests, especially in Gaul, modern-day France. But the Senate feared him. When he marched his army across the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, he broke the sacred law forbidding generals from bringing legions into Rome. This was an act of war. Caesar seized power, becoming dictator for life. He promised reforms, but many in the Senate saw only tyranny. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, he was assassinated by senators who believed they were saving the Republic. They were wrong. Instead of restoring democracy, Caesar's death plunged Rome into chaos. Civil wars erupted. One by one, his enemies fell. And out of the ashes, a new leader emerged. Caesar's heir, Octavian, was young but ruthless. He outmaneuvered every rival, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and in 27 BCE, he stood as the undisputed ruler of Rome. But he was careful. He did not call himself a king. Instead, he took the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. Rome was no longer a republic. It was an empire. With Augustus at the helm, Rome entered its greatest era, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For nearly 200 years, Rome thrived. Roads stretched across continents, trade flourished, and grand monuments like the Colosseum and the Pantheon rose. Rome had conquered the world, but the seeds of its fall had already been sown. Rome was not born an empire. It fought to become one. The backbone of its power, the Roman legions. Unlike the scattered militias of their enemies, Roman soldiers were highly trained, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. Every legionnaire was a master of combat, trained to fight in tight formations, using strategy and precision rather than brute force. The testudo, or tortoise formation, allowed soldiers to advance under a shell of shields, impervious to enemy arrows. The triple line formation ensured fresh troops could rotate into battle, never allowing exhaustion to weaken the army. With these tactics, Rome conquered lands at an unprecedented speed. Gaul, modern France, fell to Julius Caesar after a brutal campaign that cemented his name in history. Egypt, the wealthiest kingdom of the ancient world, became a Roman province after the fall of Cleopatra. Britannia, a land of fierce warriors and unforgiving terrain, was subdued by the relentless march of the legions. Rome's influence spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and deep into Europe. But military strength alone was not enough. Rome needed infrastructure to hold its empire together. An empire is only as strong as its foundations. Rome didn't just conquer, it built. Across its vast territories, Roman engineers created roads, bridges, aqueducts, and cities, a network that kept the empire connected and thriving. Roman roads, over 250,000 miles of roads, crisscrossed the empire, paved with stone and built to last for centuries. These roads allowed legions to move quickly, traders to thrive, and cultures to connect. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was more than just a phrase. It was reality. Fresh water was the lifeblood of Rome. Aqueducts stretched for miles, bringing clean water to cities, fountains, and baths. The Romans didn't just build cities, they made them livable, luxurious, and advanced. Architecture and engineering feats. The Colosseum, a massive amphitheater where 50,000 spectators watched gladiatorial battles. Its design still inspires modern stadiums. The Pantheon, a temple with a massive concrete dome, an architectural wonder that has stood for nearly 2,000 years. The use of concrete, arches, and domes allowed Romans to build structures that still stand today, outlasting empires that came after them. But Rome's influence wasn't just physical, it was intellectual. Rome was more than just a military and engineering powerhouse. It shaped the very ideas that define modern civilization. Latin, the language of Rome, became the foundation for Spanish, French, Italian, and many other languages. Roman literature and philosophy, the works of Cicero, Virgil, and Seneca, continue to be studied, but perhaps Rome's greatest contribution was its legal system. Roman law laid the foundation for modern legal principles, including trial by jury, property rights, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty. Rome was more than an empire. It was an idea, a blueprint for civilization. The Roman Empire eventually fell, but its influence never faded. Its roads became the pathways of history. Its laws became the foundation of justice. Its language shaped the way we speak. Its architecture still stands, defying the passage of time. Rome was not just a city, it was a force that shaped the world. And in many ways it still lives on today. It all began in 509 BCE, when Rome cast off the shackles of monarchy and declared itself a republic. But freedom came with challenges. Rome was surrounded by powerful and hostile enemies: the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites in the rugged mountains, and the Greeks in the south. Each of these civilizations had its own ambitions, and they saw Rome as an upstart city-state rather than a rising superpower. For the fledgling republic, expansion was not a choice, it was a necessity. To survive, Rome had to dominate or be dominated. What followed was a relentless campaign of conquest, a struggle for supremacy that would see Rome defeat its rivals one by one. And with each victory, the Republic grew stronger, laying the foundation for an empire that would one day rule the Mediterranean. This is the story of Rome's conquest of Italy. The battles, the betrayals, and the strategies that turned a small city into an unstoppable force. The first challenge to Rome's survival came from its immediate neighbors in Latium. The Latin tribes, sharing cultural and linguistic ties with Rome, resisted its growing dominance. In a series of wars throughout the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Rome systematically defeated and absorbed these Latin city-states. Through a combination of military strength and political diplomacy, Rome established itself as the dominant force in the region. However, Rome's ambitions did not go unnoticed. To the north, the powerful Etruscan city of Veii posed a major threat. Veii, a wealthy and influential city, rivaled Rome in power and territory. After years of skirmishes, Rome launched a decisive campaign in 406 BCE. Led by the legendary general Camillus, the Romans laid siege to Veii for a decade. In 396 BCE, after relentless pressure, the city fell. Its people were enslaved, and its land was absorbed into Roman territory. Rome's first major conquest beyond its immediate borders. Just as Rome celebrated its victory over Veii, a new and terrifying threat emerged. In 390 BCE, a massive horde of Gauls, led by the warlord Brennus, swept down from the north. At the Battle of the Allia, the Roman army was disastrously defeated, and the city of Rome itself was sacked. The Gauls pillaged the city and extorted a massive ransom before withdrawing. This event left an indelible mark on Roman memory. Determined never to suffer such humiliation again, Rome rebuilt its defenses, strengthened its military, and embarked on an aggressive expansionist policy. The Republic's new goal was clear: dominate Italy to ensure Rome's survival. As Rome expanded, it inevitably clashed with the Samnites, a fierce and warlike people who controlled much of central and southern Italy. The First Samnite War erupted in 343 BCE when the city of Capua, under threat from the Samnites, called for Roman protection. Rome saw an opportunity to extend its influence into Campania, a region rich in resources and strategically valuable for future expansion. The war began with Rome winning a series of early victories. The Roman legions, employing superior organization and tactics, overwhelmed Samnite forces in pitched battles. However, the rugged terrain of Samnium made sustained conquest difficult. The Samnites, skilled guerrilla fighters, launched counterattacks that made further Roman advances costly. By 341 BCE, both sides were exhausted. A truce was negotiated, and Rome withdrew from Samnite territory, but not without gains. Rome had successfully asserted its power in Campania and demonstrated its military superiority. However, tensions between the two powers remained unresolved, setting the stage for further conflict. By the late 4th century BCE, Rome had solidified its control over central Italy, but not all of its allies were content with its growing power. The Latin cities, which had long been Rome's partners in warfare and politics, began to resist Roman dominance. They had fought alongside Rome in previous wars, particularly against the Samnites, but now they sought full equality or independence. When Rome refused to grant them equal status, tensions boiled over into open conflict, sparking the Latin War, 340 to 338 BCE. The Latin League, a coalition of independent Latin city-states, joined forces with the Campanians, aiming to challenge Roman supremacy. The war began in 340 BCE with a dramatic battle at Vesuvius, where Rome, led by the consuls Titus Manlius Torquatus and Publius Decius Mus, faced a combined Latin and Campanian army. The battle was hard-fought, and a moment of great Roman discipline and sacrifice emerged when Decius Mus performed the ancient ritual of devotio, sacrificing himself by charging into enemy lines to inspire his troops. This act bolstered Roman morale, and the Latins were defeated. Another major engagement occurred at Tryphanum, where the Latins suffered another devastating loss. With their forces shattered, the Latin cities could no longer resist Roman might. By 338 BCE, the war had ended, and Rome imposed its will upon Latium. Rather than destroying the Latin cities, Rome adopted a unique strategy: partial integration. Some cities were granted full Roman citizenship, while others became allies under Roman oversight. This system ensured loyalty while allowing Rome to expand its power without constant warfare. The Latin War was a turning point, marking the transition from Rome as one Italian power among many to the undisputed ruler of Latium, setting the stage for further expansion. The Second Samnite War was one of the most intense and defining conflicts of early Roman history. Unlike the First Samnite War, which ended in a temporary truce, this war would test Rome's resilience, military adaptability, and capacity for prolonged warfare. Tensions reignited in 326 BCE when the city of Neapolis, modern Naples, sought Rome's protection against Samnite aggression. Rome, eager to extend its influence in southern Italy, intervened, leading to all-out war with the Samnites. The early years saw Roman successes, but in 321 BCE, the war took a disastrous turn at the Battle of the Caudine Forks. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for Part 2, where we dive into the humiliation at Caudine Forks, the Third Samnite War, the conquest of northern Italy, and the Battle of Lake Vadimo. In one of the most infamous defeats in Roman history, a Roman army was trapped in a narrow mountain pass by the Samnites. With no escape, the Romans were forced to surrender without a fight. To further humiliate them, the Samnites made the captured Romans pass under a yoke of spears, symbolizing their submission. This event deeply scarred Roman pride and fueled their determination for revenge. Rather than being demoralized, Rome used this loss to reform its military. The legions adapted new battlefield tactics, incorporating more flexible formations that could counter the Samnites' guerrilla warfare in mountainous terrain. Over the next 2 decades, Rome fought relentlessly, securing key victories and wearing down Samnite resistance. By 304 BCE, the war ended in a decisive Roman victory. The Samnites were forced into submission, solidifying Rome's dominance over central Italy. This conflict showcased Rome's resilience, military innovation, and strategic diplomacy, setting the stage for its future conquests and establishing it as the leading power in Italy. The Third Samnite War was the final and most decisive confrontation between Rome and the Samnites. Unlike the previous wars, this conflict escalated into a large-scale struggle for control of Italy, drawing in powerful allies on both sides. The Samnites, realizing they could not defeat Rome alone, forged a grand coalition with the Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls, all of whom saw Roman expansion as a threat to their independence. This war would determine the future of Italy. The war began in 298 BCE, when Rome launched a preemptive strike into Samnite territory, winning a key victory at Battle of Bovianum. However, the Samnites regrouped and called upon their allies. By 296 BCE, a massive anti-Roman alliance had formed, forcing Rome to prepare for its greatest challenge yet. The turning point came at the Battle of Sentinum, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the early Republic. Facing a vast Samnite Gallic army, the Romans, led by consuls Quintus Fabius, Maximus Rullianus, and Publius Decius Mus, fought a desperate battle. In a dramatic moment, Decius Mus, following his father's example in the Latin War, sacrificed himself by charging into enemy lines to inspire his troops. This act of devotio turned the tide, and Rome emerged victorious. With Sentinum won, the coalition collapsed. By 290 BCE, the Samnites were finally subdued, marking the end of their challenge to Roman supremacy. Rome now dominated central Italy, clearing the path for future conquests. The war cemented Rome's military reputation and strengthened its grip over Italy, bringing it one step closer to empire. With central Italy firmly under Roman control after the defeat of the Samnites, Rome turned its attention to the north, where 2 formidable enemies still posed a threat: the Etruscans and the Gauls. The Etruscans, once the dominant power in Italy, were still resisting Roman expansion, while the warlike Gauls, who had once sacked Rome in 390 BCE, continued to launch devastating raids from the Po Valley. The war was sparked when the Gallic Senones tribe attacked a Roman colony in northern Etruria. In response, Rome launched a military campaign to drive the Gauls out, leading to a full-scale war with both the Gauls and their Etruscan allies. The Roman Senate recognized that this war was not just about revenge. It was about securing the rich and fertile lands of northern Italy and ensuring the Republic's long-term safety. The key moment in the war came at Lake Vadimo, where the Romans, under the command of P. Cornelius Dolabella, faced a powerful Etruscan Gallic coalition. The battle was fierce, with the Gauls charging with their renowned ferocity. However, The superior discipline and tactics of the Roman legions ultimately prevailed. The Etruscans and Gauls suffered catastrophic losses, effectively breaking their power in the region. Following the victory, Rome systematically subdued the remaining Etruscan cities, bringing them under its influence. The war ended in 282 BCE, marking the end of Etruscan independence and securing northern Italy as part of Rome's growing domain. With this conquest, Rome had successfully removed another major obstacle to its dominance, paving the way for its next great challenge, the Greek cities of southern Italy. By the late 4th century BCE, Rome had conquered most of Italy, but one final challenge remained: the wealthy and powerful Greek city-states of southern Italy. Chief among them was Tarentum, a prosperous city with a strong navy. Fearing Roman expansion, the Tarentines sought help from King Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the greatest military commanders of his time. Pyrrhus, eager to carve out an empire in the west, answered the call and arrived in Italy in 280 BCE with 25,000 seasoned troops and 20 war elephants, a terrifying new weapon the Romans had never encountered before. Rome, confident in its growing military might, marched south to meet Pyrrhus. In the Battle of Heraclea, Pyrrhus deployed his elephants, which caused havoc among the Roman ranks. Despite their discipline, the Romans were unfamiliar with these massive beasts and suffered a narrow defeat. However, Pyrrhus was shocked by Rome's resilience. Unlike the fractured Greek states, Rome refused to negotiate and simply raised another army. The following year, the two armies clashed again at Asculum. Pyrrhus once more won the battle, but at a devastating cost. His casualties were so high that he famously remarked, "If we win another battle like this, we will be utterly ruined." From this, the term Pyrrhic victory was born, a win that comes at too great a price. By 275 BCE, Pyrrhus's resources were depleted, and his Italian allies were wavering. At the Battle of Beneventum, Rome finally defeated Pyrrhus, forcing him to withdraw. Without his leadership, Tarentum surrendered in 272 BCE, marking the end of Greek resistance in Italy. Rome had now conquered the entire peninsula, setting the stage for its rise as a Mediterranean superpower. By 272 BCE, after nearly 2 centuries of continuous warfare, Rome had become the undisputed master of Italy. From the rugged Apennine Mountains to the fertile plains of Campania and the northern Etruscan heartlands, no rival power remained to challenge Roman dominance. However, securing military victories was only part of Rome's success. The real challenge lay in governing and integrating the diverse peoples of the Italian peninsula. Rather than ruling through direct occupation, Rome devised an ingenious system of alliances and colonies that allowed it to control vast territories without constant military intervention. Conquered cities were divided into different categories. Some were granted full Roman citizenship, allowing them to participate in the Republic's political system. Others became Latin allies, enjoying partial rights but bound to provide soldiers for Rome's legions. Many cities remained autonomous allies, allowed to govern themselves as long as they pledged loyalty and contributed troops when needed. This system ensured a steady supply of manpower for the Roman army, which would prove crucial in future wars. Instead of simply subjugating its conquests, Rome integrated its allies into the growing republic. Over time, loyal cities could gain Roman citizenship, incentivizing them to support Rome rather than rebel. This policy created a sense of unity across Italy, making the newly conquered territories not just subjects, but future Romans. With Italy unified under Roman control, the Republic had established a powerful military and economic base. This dominance over Italy set the stage for the next phase of Roman expansion, conquering the Mediterranean, beginning with its greatest rival, Carthage. The conquest of Italy was only the beginning of Rome's rise to empire. Rome's conquest of Italy was more than a military achievement. It was the first step toward global domination. With a unified Italy, Rome turned its sights on external enemies, leading to the Punic Wars and the creation of a Mediterranean empire. The conquest of Italy had transformed Rome from a city-state into the world's most powerful republic. The age of Roman supremacy had begun.
Imagine this. Two of the most powerful forces in the ancient world are locked in a battle for supremacy, fighting on land and sea in a clash that would change history forever. For 23 years, Rome and Carthage fought with everything they had, inventing new strategies, building massive fleets, and enduring endless battles. Welcome to the First Punic War, the war that shaped the future of the Mediterranean. Let's rewind to 264 BCE. The Mediterranean was the center of the ancient world. Whoever controlled its waters controlled trade, wealth, and power. On one side of this rivalry was Rome, a growing republic, and Italy with an unstoppable army. On the other side was Carthage, a rich city-state on the North African coast whose navy ruled the waves. At first glance, these two powers couldn't have been more different. Rome was a land-based power with disciplined armies and an obsession with expanding its borders. Carthage, on the other hand, was a seafaring empire. Its massive fleet protected its trade routes and brought wealth from across the Mediterranean. The conflict began over a seemingly small issue: control of the island of Sicily. This strategic island was the perfect staging ground for controlling trade between Europe and Africa. Both Rome and Carthage wanted it, and neither side was willing to back down. What started as a small conflict on Sicily quickly escalated into one of the longest and most grueling wars in history. Imagine Rome. The Roman Republic was a powerhouse on land. Its legions were made up of citizens who trained to fight with precision and discipline. But while their soldiers were second to none, Rome had a major weakness. It didn't have a navy. They relied on their allies for seafaring, and compared to Carthage, they were amateurs at naval warfare. Carthage, on the other hand, was a maritime superpower. The quinqueremes, warships with 5 rows of oars, dominated the seas. Carthage had years of experience as traders and sailors, and their wealth allowed them to hire mercenaries to fight on land. However, their government wasn't as unified as Rome's, which often led to disagreements during wartime. Rome's strength was in its relentless determination. Carthage's strength lay in its mastery of the sea. These differences would define the First Punic War. Key events and battles that took place in the First Punic War. The Siege of Messana. The war's origins trace back to the Sicilian time of Messana. This small but strategically located city became the focal point of a bitter rivalry. Messana sat at the northeastern tip of Sicily, controlling a narrow strait that was vital for trade and military movements. At the time, Messana was under the control of a group of mercenaries called the Mamertines. These men were former soldiers who had taken over the city and ruled it with force. However, their power was under threat from two sides. The Greek city-state of Syracuse, led by King Hiero II, wanted to capture Messana and bring it under their control. At the same time, Carthage saw an opportunity to expand its influence and protect its trade routes by taking Messana. Feeling trapped, the Mamertines reached out to both Rome and Carthage for help. This decision was like poking a hornet's nest. Carthage was quick to find forces to Messana, establishing a garrison in the city. Rome, on the other hand, hesitated. Some Roman leaders didn't want to get involved in a conflict so far from home, especially since it could mean war with Carthage. However, Rome eventually decided to act. The fear that allowing Carthage to control Messina would give them too much power in Sicily and threaten Rome's growing influence in southern Italy. Roman troops crossed the sea and entered Messina, forcing the Carthaginian garrison to withdraw. This move infuriated Carthage, and they quickly declared war. The siege of Messina marked the start of open hostilities between Rome and Carthage, dragging both powers into a larger conflict. What began as a local dispute over a small city would soon become a full-scale war, including thousands of sailors and soldiers. When the war began, Rome was at significant disadvantage. The legions were unmatched on land, but the Mediterranean was Carthage's territory. The Carthaginian navy roamed the seas, and without a fleet, Rome could not effectively challenge them. But the Romans weren't the type to give up easily. They decided to build a navy from scratch, a daring and ambitious move. To speed up the process, they captured a Carthaginian quinquereme that had run aground and used it as a blueprint. This ship, with its 5 rows of oars, was the backbone of Carthage's navy, and Rome planned to use it against them. Building the ships was only half the battle. The Romans now faced another challenge. They didn't know how to sail. To train their crews, they practiced rowing on dry land using mock ships set up on the shore. This gave the rowers and marines a basic understanding of how to work together. The Romans also added their own innovation, the corvus or crow. This was a girding plank with a large spike on the end. During a battle, the corvus could be swung onto an enemy ship where it would latch on like a giant claw. Battle of Mylae. With their newly built navy, Rome faced its first major test at the Battle of Mylae. This battle took place off the northern coast of Sicily and was a defining moment in the war. The Carthaginian fleet, confident in their naval superiority, approached Mylae expecting an easy victory. They had over 100 warships compared to Rome's fleet of about the same size, but they underestimated Rome's determination and ingenuity. As the battle began, the Romans used their corvus to devastating effect. When the Carthaginian ships tried to ram them, the Romans dropped the corvus onto the army decks, turning the sea into a chaotic battlefield. Carthaginian sailors used to quick naval engagements found themselves outmatched in close combat by Roman soldiers. Rome's commander Gaius Duilius led the fleet with courage and skill. Under his leadership, the Romans captured or sank over 50 Carthaginian ships, a staggering victory for a navy that hadn't existed just a few years earlier. The Battle of Mylae was a turning point. It proved that Rome could challenge Carthage at sea and boosted Roman morale. Duilius was awarded a triumph, and a column decorated with the bronze rams of captured Carthaginian ships was erected in his honor. The invasion of Africa. After the successes in Sicily, Rome decided to strike directly at the heart of Carthage. The plan was bold: launch an invasion of North Africa to force Carthage into surrender. In 256 BCE, a massive Roman fleet set sail, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers under the command of Marcus Atilius Regulus. After a dramatic naval victory at Cape Economus, one of the biggest sea battles in history, the Romans landed on the shores of North Africa. First, the invasion went well. The Roman legions defeated Carthaginian forces in a series of battles and advanced towards Carthage itself. The Carthaginians were caught off guard and desperate to stop the Romans. But Rome's luck didn't last. The Carthaginians hired Xanthippus, a skilled Greek mercenary commander, to reorganize their army. Xanthippus brought discipline and strategy to the Carthaginian forces, and he knew exactly how to exploit Rome's weaknesses. In 255 BCE, the two sides clashed in a decisive battle. Xanthippus used war elephants to break the Roman lines and cavalry to outflank their forces. The Roman army was crushed, with thousands killed or captured. Regulus himself was taken prisoner and later died in captivity, becoming a symbol of Roman heroism and sacrifice. The invasion of Africa was a costly failure for Rome, but it didn't break their spirit. They regrouped and continued the fight in Sicily, determined to achieve victory. The Battle of Agates Islands, 241 BCE. After years of brutal fighting, the war finally came to a climactic end at the Agates Islands. Rome, having rebuilt its navy yet again, launched a surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet. Despite being outnumbered, the Roman ships were lighter and faster, allowing them to outmaneuver the Carthaginians. Rome's victory at sea forced Carthage to surrender. After 23 years of war, Rome emerged as the new dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The First Punic War was a turning point in history. For Rome, this was the first step in Rome's transformation from a regional power to a global empire. By winning Sicily, they gained their first province outside Italy. More importantly, they proved they could adapt to new challenges like naval warfare. For Carthage, the war was a devastating blow. They lost control of Sicily, their navy was severely weakened, and they were forced to pay a massive indemnity to Rome. However, Carthage wasn't finished yet. This defeat planted the seeds for the Second Punic War, where they would seek revenge under the leadership of the brilliant general Hannibal. The First Punic War taught the world several lessons. Adaptability wins wars. Rome's ability to build a navy from scratch and innovate with the corvus was a game changer. War has a heavy price. The war was one of the costliest in ancient history. Thousands of lives were lost, cities were destroyed, and entire economies were drained. It was a stark reminder of the human and financial toll of prolonged conflict. Rivalries shape history. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage didn't end with the First Punic War. It set the stage for even greater conflicts, including Hannibal's legendary campaign during the Second Punic War. This war marked the beginning of Rome's rise as a superpower. It showed the importance of perseverance, innovation, and strategic thinking, qualities that are still valuable today. The conflict also highlights the dangers of unending rivalries and the cost of war, lessons that resonate even in modern times. Most importantly, the First Punic War reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit. Both Rome and Carthage faced incredible challenges, but they kept fighting for what they believed in. Their story inspires us to stay determined no matter the odds. The First Punic War was just the opening act in a much larger drama. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage would continue to shape the ancient world, leading to epic stories of heroism, strategy, and survival. And who knows, perhaps this tale of resilience and rivalry will inspire you to face your own challenges with the same determination that Rome and Carthage showed up so long ago. Stay curious and remember, history isn't just about the past, it's a guide for the future.
Imagine you're a Roman soldier. The sun burns your back, sweat stings your eyes, and in front of you, chaos. A sea of enemy warriors closing in, their weapons flashing in the unforgiving sunlight, their war cries chilling your blood. But they are not just any warriors. No, they are led by the most feared commander of the ancient world, Hannibal Barca. Suddenly the earth trembles. No, not an earthquake. Something worse. A deep, thunderous rumble. You feel it before you see it. Then, out of the dust, they emerge. Giant war elephants, their ivory tusks gleaming, their sheer size sending fear coursing through your veins. They charge straight at you, crushing men and shields alike under their massive weight. This is not a nightmare. This is real. This is the Second Punic War, the war that nearly destroyed Rome. But how did it come to this? How did one man almost bring the mighty Roman Republic to its knees? And most importantly, why does it still matter today? Buckle up, because this is one of the greatest war stories in history. Before we dive into the action, let's go back to the beginning. Two great powers ruled the Mediterranean, Rome and Carthage. Rising superpower of Italy, known for its disciplined legions and relentless ambition. Carthage, a wealthy and powerful city in North Africa, a thriving trade hub with a navy that ruled the seas. They had already fought one war, the First Punic War. Rome won, but Carthage never forgot the humiliation. And in Carthage, a young boy named Hannibal stood before his father. His small hands clenched into fists as he swore a blood oath, an oath to destroy Rome. Fast forward a few decades, and Hannibal was ready to keep his promise. He didn't just want to fight Rome, he wanted to crush it. If you were Hannibal, how would you attack Rome? Would you A. build a huge navy and invade by sea? B. march straight through enemy territory? C. try something crazy that no one would expect? The answer, crazy something, something no one expected. Hannibal decided to march his entire army, including war elephants, through the Alps. It was one of the most daring moves in military history. Hannibal and his army, 40,000 men, thousands of horses and 37 war elephants, began the impossible journey across the Alps. Freezing temperatures, starvation, avalanche after avalanche. They battled not just the elements, but hostile mountain tribes attacking from above. The narrow paths crumbled beneath their feet. Thousands died. But Hannibal pushed on. And when they finally emerged, they weren't just alive, they were ready for war. And that's when the Romans got the news. Hannibal had arrived from the north. Rome had never expected an attack from the north. And that's exactly what Hannibal wanted. Then came the moment that sent shockwaves through history. The Battle of Cannae. Hannibal faced a Roman army twice the size of his own. The Romans thought they had him trapped. They charged in full force, believing their numbers alone would secure victory. But Hannibal had a plan. He let the Romans push forward, then, boom, his cavalry slammed into their sides. The crescent formation closed like a vice, surrounding the Romans completely. They were trapped. The result? A massacre. 50,000 Roman soldiers fell that day. Some say the rivers ran, red with blood. Rome had never suffered a defeat like this before. Panic spread. People thought it was over, that Rome would fall. If you were a Roman leader after this disaster, what would you do? Would you A. surrender to Hannibal? B. fight harder no matter the cost? C. build a time machine and try again? Just kidding, that wasn't an option. The Romans? They chose B. fight harder. But this time they fought smarter. Scipio Africanus, Rome's answer to Hannibal. He realized something important. Instead of chasing Hannibal around Italy, he'd attack Carthage itself. If Carthage was in danger, Hannibal would have to come back and defend it, and it worked. Hannibal was forced to return home. And that set the stage for one final epic showdown. This was it, the final battle. Rome versus Carthage. Scipio versus Hannibal, two of the greatest military minds in history. But Rome had learned from its mistakes. Scipio had a trick up his sleeve. As the elephants charged, the Roman soldiers opened gaping pathways, letting them pass harmlessly through. Then the Romans counterattacked. And just like that, it was over. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage surrendered. The war was over. The Second Punic War changed history forever. Rome survived its darkest hour. And because of this victory, it would go on to build one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. But what about Hannibal? He never stopped fighting, always on the run, until he took his own life rather than be captured. His name still echoes through history as one of the greatest military minds of all time.
The final showdown between Rome and Carthage. Imagine a city so rich that its people decorated their temples with gold and silver. A city so powerful, it once controlled the Mediterranean Sea. Now imagine that same city being burned to the ground, its people taken away as slaves, and its name erased from history books for years. That's the story of the Third Punic War, the final and most brutal conflict between two ancient superpowers, Rome and Carthage. For over a century, Rome and Carthage were fighting on control over trade, land, and power in the Mediterranean. They had already fought two massive wars before. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, was a fight over who would rule the island of Sicily, and the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, saw Carthage's famous general Hannibal almost defeat Rome. But even after two wars, these ancient powerhouses couldn't let it go. Rome was paranoid. They believed Carthage was still a threat, even though Carthage had been humiliated after losing the Second Punic War. Rome had forced Carthage to pay a huge fine, give up its navy, and promised never to fight another war without Rome's permission. Still, Carthage managed to bounce back. The city became wealthy again, focusing on trade instead of war. But Rome wasn't happy. They saw Carthage's growing wealth as a sign of danger. But by the end of 149 BC, their deadly game would come to its final, disastrous conclusion. The legacy of Hannibal, a shadow over Rome. Before we dive into the Third Punic War itself, we need to understand the deep-rooted fears that pushed Rome to launch this devastating conflict. These fears were born out of the harrowing experiences of the Second Punic War, fought between 218 and 201 BC. The Second Punic War is famous for one reason: Hannibal Barca. This Carthaginian general, one of the greatest military tacticians in history, became the living embodiment of Rome's deepest fears. Hannibal's invasion of Italy is still considered one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. In 218 BC, Hannibal led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps into Italy, an unimaginable feat at the time. Over the next few years, Hannibal's forces would strike fear into the hearts of every Roman citizen. His victory at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC was a crushing blow to the Roman Republic. Out of an army of around 80,000 men, nearly 70,000 Roman soldiers were slaughtered in a single day. This disaster was so devastating that it threatened to unravel the entire Roman Republic. But despite these crushing defeats, the Romans were not defeated. In a remarkable display of resilience, Rome rebuilt its army and, under the leadership of General Scipio Africanus, eventually managed to turn the tide of the war. In 202 BC, Scipio's forces defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, forcing Carthage to surrender. However, even though Carthage lost the Second Punic War, the trauma of Hannibal's invasion was etched deeply into Roman memory. The Romans could never forget how close they came to being defeated by the Carthaginian general. His name became synonymous with fear, and the idea that Carthage could rise again to challenge Rome haunted the Roman psyche for generations. The survival of Carthage, a resurgence that couldn't be ignored. While Rome celebrated its victory in the Second Punic War, Carthage, though battered and broken, survived. The peace treaty that ended the war left Carthage severely weakened. The city was forced to pay a hefty indemnity, reduce its military to a fraction of its former size, and surrender its overseas possessions. Carthage was no longer the dominant naval and trading power it once had been. However, despite these harsh terms, Carthage did not simply disappear into history. The city began to rebuild, and by the late 2nd century BC, it had regained some of its former wealth. Trade flourished once more, and its merchants were once again conducting business across the Mediterranean. But for many Romans, this revival of Carthage was a source of deep concern. The idea that Carthage, despite its earlier defeat, could recover and once again pose a threat to Rome was deeply unsettling. The fear of Carthage's resurgence, particularly among the Roman elite, became one of the driving forces behind the decision to go to war once again. Rome's leaders, haunted by the memory of Hannibal, feared that if left unchecked, Carthage could rebuild its power and challenge Roman supremacy once again. Rome's political elite, including figures such as Cato the Elder, began to push for drastic action. Cato, who had seen the devastation wrought by Hannibal's invasion, became a staunch advocate for the total destruction of Carthage. In every speech he made in the Senate, Cato would famously end with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed." These words echoed throughout Roman political circles, stirring the public spheres and pushing for a final, all-out war. The catalyst, Rome and Numidia. In 150 BC, an event provided the perfect excuse for Rome to act. Carthage found itself at odds with its neighbor, the Kingdom of Numidia, a client kingdom of Rome. The Numidian king, Massinissa, had been encroaching on Carthaginian territory. Carthage, desperate to protect its borders, took military action. This move, though driven by defensive concerns, was seen by the Romans as a violation of the peace treaty that had been signed after the Second Punic War. Rome's reaction was swift and harsh. Rome demanded that Carthage disarm and dismantle its city defenses. Impossible demands that left the Carthaginians with little choice but to resist. At this point, the political climate in Rome was strongly anti-Carthaginian. The Senate, influenced by Cato's rhetoric and the fear of Carthage's resurgence, was determined to eliminate the threat once and for all. Rome, in its eyes, had no choice but to act decisively. The war was inevitable. Carthage's resistance and the siege begins. The Carthaginians, knowing that Rome would not back down, made their final stand. The city of Carthage was well fortified, with high walls and a strong defensive position. However, it was not only the walls that the Romans would have to overcome, it was the will of the Carthaginian people to survive. Despite their weakened state, Carthage's leaders and citizens were determined to protect their home from the Roman threat. The Roman army, led by Scipio Aemilianus, was a seasoned and formidable force. It consisted of both Roman soldiers and mercenaries, including troops from Rome's allies, which was crucial for the long and costly siege that lay ahead. Initially, the Romans set up their camp outside the city's strong walls, intending to block any escape and prevent Carthage from receiving supplies or reinforcements. The Carthaginians began to prepare for the worst. They fortified their defenses, mobilized their forces, and attempted to rally their people. The leader of Carthage, Hasdrubal, took command of the defense, knowing that the city's survival depended on his ability to hold off the Roman legions. Hasdrubal, though not as famous as Hannibal, was a skilled commander in his own right. However, despite his best efforts, the Carthaginian forces were no match for the overwhelming power of Rome. In 149 BC, the Romans began their siege of Carthage. As the siege began, the Romans quickly established a blockade around Carthage. They cut off trade routes and intercepted supplies from the rest of North Africa. But this did not immediately bring Carthage to its knees. The Carthaginians proved resourceful and resilient, continuing to fight back. For the Romans, the siege was more than just a military operation. It was a test of endurance and patience. Despite the blockade, Carthage remained steadfast, and the siege continued into the second year, with both sides preparing for a prolonged struggle. The Carthaginian military, though weakened from previous wars, still managed to put up fierce resistance, using their naval fleet and internal defenses to maintain control of key sections of the city. The Carthaginian navy, while not as large as it once had been, still played a significant role in defending their coastlines, even though it was mostly confined to the city's harbor. The Romans, who were not only aiming to starve the city into submission, but also seeking to destroy its power, launched repeated raids on Carthaginian positions. However, Carthage continued to rebuild its defenses and make use of its formidable defenses. After a prolonged period of blockade and skirmishes, the Romans began a full siege of Carthage in 147 BC. The Romans constructed siege walls around the city to trap the defenders inside. This wall effectively isolated Carthage, leaving the defenders with limited options. The Carthaginians tried several times to break through the siege lines, but these attempts were repelled by the Romans. The Romans began building siege towers, battering rams, and other machinery in an attempt to breach Carthage's thick walls. They also constructed a series of trenches to help protect their own soldiers from the Carthaginian attacks. Despite this, Carthage still held out, and the situation became even more dire for the Romans, who suffered both from exhaustion and the harsh conditions surrounding the siege. As the siege wore on, the Romans began to face their own difficulties. Supplies were strained, and some soldiers became disillusioned by the protracted battle. However, the Romans had learned from previous sieges and had mastered the art of maintaining long-term campaigns. They were able to draw upon their allies in Numidia and other parts of North Africa, ensuring that they could maintain a steady supply of food and reinforcements. Carthage was not without its options for defending itself. Despite being heavily besieged, the Carthaginians made repeated efforts to counterattack. They used their remaining warships to launch raids on Roman supply lines, and even attempted to break through the Roman blockade. On a few occasions, the Carthaginians succeeded in damaging Roman forces, particularly in their attempts to fight back at the blockade on land. Despite these efforts, Carthage's resources were being drained faster than they could replenish them. The city's food stores were dwindling, and morale was sinking. The Romans, on the other hand, were increasingly able to cut off vital resources and press the siege even harder. The fall of Carthage, the final assault. By 146 BC, the Romans had gathered enough strength to launch a full assault on the city. The siege had dragged on for years, but the Carthaginians' resolve had not faltered. The city's defenders fought with everything they had, but their efforts were in vain. The Romans, led by Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of Scipio Africanus, pressed forward with ruthless determination. The final assault on the city was brutal, with house-to-house fighting that turned the streets of Carthage into a battlefield. Carthage, once a proud and powerful empire, was no more. The lasting impact of the Third Punic War. For Rome, the victory in the Third Punic War solidified its position as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. With Carthage destroyed, Rome was free to expand its influence even further. The war also marked the beginning of a new phase of Roman imperialism, as the Republic transitioned toward becoming an empire. For the people of Carthage, the Third Punic War was the final chapter in their city's long and storied history. They had fought with courage, but ultimately, their defeat signaled the end of their empire.
Veni, vidi, veci. I came to a Rome of crumbling dignity, torn by greed and rot, and I made her whole. I am Gaius Julius Caesar, born of the Iuli, descended from Venus herself. My youth burned with ambition. I saw the Senate grovel in luxury while the people starved in silence. So I rose. I crossed the Rubicon with iron in my eyes, not as a rebel, but as Rome's savior. They called me traitor, but I gave them Gaul, an empire's jewel bathed in blood and brilliance. I gave them law. I gave them peace. I dared crown order where there was chaos. Yes, I wore the laurel. Dictator, they whispered, but beloved in the streets, feared in the courts. I dined with kings. I shattered tyrants, and I stood with the people. Yet it was not my enemies that ended me. It was my friends. Brutus, et tu. My final breath was not of fear, but of fate. My death was the price of my immortality. I am not gone. Rome lives because of me. I planted the seed. My bloodline bore emperors. My name, Caesar, became title, became legend. When you speak of empires, remember who forged the mold.
From a young aristocrat to the ruler of the Roman world, this is the story of how Julius Caesar became Rome's most powerful man. Rome in the 1st century BCE was a republic in crisis. Corruption, political violence, and power struggles between ambitious generals had thrown the state into chaos. The Senate, once the heart of Roman democracy, was now a battleground for elite factions, each vying for control. In this unstable world, Julius Caesar rose faster than anyone expected. Through military genius, strategic alliances, and sheer ambition, he transformed himself from a young politician into the most feared and respected leader in Rome. But how did he do it? What key moments and bold decisions set him apart from his rivals? And how did his unstoppable rise lead to both his greatest triumph and his downfall? This is the story of Caesar's path to ultimate power. Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE into the Iulii family, an ancient but politically weak patrician lineage. Though his family claimed descent from Venus, they lacked real power, and Caesar was determined to change that. His first challenge came early. His uncle Gaius Marius was a powerful general who led Rome's populous faction. But when Lucius Cornelius Sulla seized power in a brutal civil war, Marius's allies, including Caesar, were targeted for execution. Refusing to submit, Caesar fled Rome and went into hiding. After Sulla's death, he returned to Rome, using charisma and calculated risks to climb the political ladder. He built a reputation as a brilliant orator, ruthless strategist, and champion of the common people. But Caesar knew that political success alone wasn't enough. Real power in Rome came from military victories. To achieve greatness, he needed a war, and soon he would find one. Returning to Rome, Caesar wasted no time building his influence. He became a military tribune, then a senator, using bribery, alliances, and populist policies to win the favor of the people. His charisma and ambition made him a rising star, but also a growing threat to Rome's elite. In 60 BCE, Caesar made a bold move. He formed the First Triumvirate, a secret alliance with Pompey the Great, Rome's most powerful general, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome. This three-man power block controlled Roman politics and ensured Caesar's election as consul in 59 BCE. As consul, he pushed radical reforms, redistributing land to the poor and strengthening his military command. But the Senate hated him, fearing he was becoming too powerful. His enemies planned to strip him of influence, so Caesar made his next move. He secured a governorship in Gaul, a land filled with riches and war. If he wanted to dominate Rome, he needed a legendary military campaign, and in Gaul he would find it. In 58 BCE, Caesar launched his campaign in Gaul, a vast warlike land that had resisted Roman control for centuries. His goal? Conquer it, plunder its riches, and forge an unstoppable army loyal to him alone. For nearly a decade, Caesar waged brutal war against the fierce Gallic tribes, using military innovation, deception, and sheer ruthlessness. He crushed the Helvetii, defeated the Germanic king Ariovistus, and annihilated the Belgae in northern Gaul. Each victory increased his power, wealth, and reputation. But his greatest challenge came in 52 BCE, when a Gallic leader named Vercingetorix united the tribes in a massive rebellion. The war climaxed at the Siege of Alesia, where Caesar, outnumbered, surrounded the enemy and built a double wall of fortifications, defeating the Gallic army in a legendary battle. By 50 BCE, Gaul was fully under Roman control, and Caesar had become the most powerful general in the Republic. But back in Rome, his enemies were plotting against him. The Senate, led by Pompey, ordered him to disband his army. Caesar now faced a choice: submit and lose everything, or seize power by force. With Rome under his control, Caesar's next challenge was to eliminate Pompey and the Senate's loyalist forces. Though he had taken the capital, his enemies were regrouping across the Republic. To truly rule Rome, he needed to win the war. In 48 BCE, Caesar pursued Pompey to Greece, where their armies met at the Battle of Pharsalus. Caesar's outnumbered forces used superior tactics to lure Pompey into a trap, crushing his army. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking asylum, but upon arrival, Pharaoh Ptolemy XIII betrayed and assassinated him, hoping to win Caesar's favor. But the plan backfired. Caesar was furious. He wanted to defeat Pompey himself, not see him murdered. He remained in Egypt, aligning himself with Cleopatra, supporting her claim to the throne in the Alexandrian War. Their alliance, both political and personal, secured Egypt as a loyal client state of Rome. Over the next few years, Caesar hunted down the last Pompeian loyalists, defeating them in North Africa, Battle of Thapsus, 46 BCE, and Spain, Battle of Munda, 45 BCE. With his enemies wiped out, he returned to Rome as the unchallenged ruler of the Republic. In 44 BCE, the Senate declared him dictator for life. He introduced massive reforms, including debt relief, a new calendar, the Julian calendar, and citizenship expansions. But his growing power and arrogance alarmed Rome's elite. To them, he was no longer a leader. He was a king in all but name, and Rome had always hated kings. Caesar had won every battle, but his final enemy would come from within the Senate itself. Julius Caesar's rise to power was one of the most dramatic in history. Through brilliant military conquests, strategic alliances, and ruthless ambition, he became the most powerful man in Rome. But his dominance made him too dangerous to live. Just months after being declared dictator for life, he was assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, a moment that would lead to the fall of the Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire.
A land of warriors, a ruthless general, and a war that would change history forever. This is the story of how Julius Caesar conquered Gaul. In 58 BCE, Gaul was a land of independent tribes, each with its own leaders, rivalries, and traditions. Fierce warriors like the Celts and Belgae dominated the landscape, resisting Roman influence for centuries. But what they lacked was unity, and that weakness would become their downfall. Enter Julius Caesar, a Roman general hungry for glory, wealth, and absolute power. With a disciplined army and a brilliant strategy, he embarked on a nearly decade-long campaign that would see entire tribes annihilated, alliances shattered, and a legendary resistance crushed. But how did one man defeat an entire region? What tactics made the Roman legions unstoppable? And how did this war propel Caesar to ultimate power and his eventual downfall? This is the story of the Gallic Wars. By 58 BCE, Julius Caesar was a rising star in Roman politics, but he needed military glory to secure his power. Rome's greatest leaders were also its greatest generals, and Caesar knew that conquering new lands would bring him riches, fame, and absolute control. Gaul was the perfect target. Though vast and heavily populated, it was a land of tribal infighting. Dozens of warring factions meant no united resistance, and Caesar saw his chance. His official excuse: Rome's northern borders were under threat from migrating Gallic tribes, particularly the Helvetii, who were moving westward. In reality, Caesar wanted a war, one that would make him powerful enough to challenge Rome itself. With an army of 50,000 hardened Roman soldiers, Caesar crossed into Gaul. The Gallic Wars had begun, and the world would never be the same. The Gallic Wars began in 58 BCE, when the Helvetii, a massive Gallic tribe of over 300,000 people, attempted to migrate into Roman-controlled territory. Caesar saw this as the perfect excuse to act. At the Battle of Bibracte, he crushed the Helvetii, forcing them to surrender and return home. This victory sent shockwaves through Gaul. Rome had arrived, and Caesar had no intention of leaving. Next, Caesar turned to an even greater threat: the Germanic king Ariovistus, who had led his warriors across the Rhine and into Gaul. At the Battle of Vosges, Caesar used superior Roman discipline and formations to decimate Ariovistus's forces, driving the Germans back across the river. With these two victories, Caesar secured his foothold in Gaul, but rather than leaving, he declared himself the protector of Gallic tribes loyal to Rome. In reality, this was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, setting Gallic factions against each other while Rome grew stronger. The message was clear: Gaul was now Caesar's battlefield. The tribes had a choice: submit to Rome or be destroyed. With his initial victories securing a foothold in Gaul, Caesar launched a full-scale conquest. His strategy? Crush all resistance, eliminate rivals, and turn divided tribes against each other. In 57 BCE, he targeted the Belgae, a powerful confederation of northern tribes known for their fierce warriors. At the Battle of the Sabes, his legions were ambushed by a massive Belgae force, but Caesar's discipline and quick thinking turned the tide. Tens of thousands of Belgae were slaughtered, and the survivors surrendered. Next, he moved west to confront the Veneti, a seafaring people who controlled critical trade routes. The Veneti tried to resist using their superior navy, but Caesar built specialized warships to defeat them. When the Veneti finally surrendered, Caesar executed their leaders and enslaved the entire population, a brutal warning to other tribes. One by one, Gaul's tribes fell to Rome's military machine. Those who surrendered were spared, but those who resisted faced annihilation. By 53 BCE, most of Gaul was under Caesar's control. But just as victory seemed certain, a new leader united the Gallic tribes for one last stand, a warrior named Vercingetorix. And he was about to give Caesar his toughest challenge yet. By 52 BCE, the Gallic tribes had suffered years of Roman occupation, massacres, and betrayals. But just when Caesar thought Gaul was conquered, a new leader rallied the tribes for one last fight: Vercingetorix, a brilliant and charismatic warrior from the Arverni tribe. Unlike previous Gallic leaders, Vercingetorix understood that Rome's strength lay in its discipline and organization. Instead of facing Caesar in open battle, he adopted a scorched earth strategy, burning villages, destroying food supplies, and using guerrilla tactics to weaken the Roman legions. At the Battle of Gergovia, Vercingetorix handed Caesar his first major defeat, forcing the Romans into retreat. The victory united more tribes under his banner, and for the first time, Gaul had a real chance to drive out the invaders. But Caesar was not finished. He regrouped, reinforced his legions, and prepared for the decisive battle that would determine the fate of Gaul. The final showdown would take place at a fortified hilltop stronghold called Alesia, where Vercingetorix would make his last stand. Caesar was about to face the greatest challenge of his career. The Battle of Alesia, 52 BCE, was the defining moment of the Gallic Wars. Vercingetorix and 80,000 warriors fortified themselves inside Alesia, a hilltop stronghold, confident they could outlast Caesar's siege. But Caesar had a plan unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Instead of storming Alesia, he built a massive wall around it, 16 miles long, trapping the Gauls inside. Then, knowing that a Gallic relief army would arrive, he built a second outer wall, creating a double-layered siege. The Romans were now fighting on two fronts, keeping Vercingetorix in and his reinforcements out. For weeks, the Gauls launched desperate assaults, but the Roman fortifications held firm. When the relief army was crushed, Vercingetorix surrendered to Caesar, marking the end of Gallic resistance. Alesia was a military masterpiece, proving Caesar's brilliance as a commander and securing his place as the most powerful man in Rome. With Vercingetorix defeated and the last major Gallic resistance crushed, Gaul was officially Roman. Over the next few years, Caesar mopped up minor rebellions, secured Roman rule, and transformed Gaul into a profitable province. But the biggest impact of the Gallic Wars wasn't on Gaul, it was on Rome itself. Caesar returned to Rome as the richest and most powerful man in the Republic. His victories brought him massive wealth, an army loyal to him alone, and the fear of the Senate. His enemies, led by Pompey, saw him as a threat to the Republic. When the Senate ordered him to disband his legions, Caesar refused. Instead, in 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon River, declaring war on Rome itself. The conquest of Gaul had made Caesar unstoppable, but it also set him on the path to civil war, dictatorship, and eventually, assassination.
Imagine standing on a battlefield, completely surrounded. Behind you, thousands of desperate warriors, trapped and starving. In front, an army of reinforcements, massive, relentless, closing in like a tidal wave. The walls you built to trap your enemies have now turned into your own cage. Any mistake means total annihilation. Yet one man didn't just survive this impossible scenario. He engineered his way to victory. How did Julius Caesar, against all odds, outmaneuver and outfight an enemy that outnumbered him 4-1? What tactical genius turned what should have been a disastrous defeat into his greatest military triumph? This was the Battle of Alesia, the decisive moment in the Gallic Wars. The rebellion, led by the formidable Vercingetorix, had pushed Rome to the brink. But at Alesia, Caesar didn't just fight a battle. He staged one of the most brilliant sieges in military history. This wasn't just a Roman victory, it was a masterclass in strategy, deception, and sheer determination. A battle that would seal the fate of Gaul and propel Caesar toward ultimate power. The Gallic Wars had raged for years. Rome, under Julius Caesar, sought to conquer Gaul, but uniting the fiercely independent tribes was impossible. Until one man changed everything. His name, Vercingetorix. A charismatic and brilliant leader, Vercingetorix did the one thing Caesar feared most. He rallied the Gauls under a single banner. Using scorched earth tactics, he denied the Romans food and forced them into brutal battles. For the first time, Caesar was struggling. After a costly victory at Gergovia, Caesar found himself on the defensive, his reputation at risk. But Vercingetorix made a critical mistake. He retreated to Alesia. Alesia wasn't just any stronghold. It was a fortified hilltop city, nearly impossible to attack. The Gauls believed it was unbreakable, but Caesar saw an opportunity, not to storm the city, but to trap Vercingetorix inside. What happened next would become one of the most legendary sieges in history. Vercingetorix and 80,000 warriors were now trapped inside Alesia, but they weren't worried. The city was fortified, had supplies, and, most importantly, a massive Gallic relief army would soon arrive. To them, it was only a matter of time before Caesar was the one surrounded. But Caesar had no intention of waiting to be crushed. Instead, he executed one of the most audacious siege strategies in history. Rather than attack Alesia, he built a wall around it. A massive 10-mile-long wooden fortification, complete with trenches, watchtowers, and deadly traps. His plan? Starve the Gauls out. But he didn't stop there. Caesar knew a relief force was coming, so he built a second wall, 14 miles long, facing outward. Yes, you heard that right. He built a double fortress, trapping Vercingetorix inside and protecting himself from an attack outside. Caesar's army of 60,000 was now a human vice, crushing the Gauls from both sides. This was not just a siege, it was engineering warfare at its finest. Inside Alesia, food began to run out. Vercingetorix sent desperate riders to call for reinforcements. But time was running out. The moment of reckoning was coming. Inside Alesia, panic set in. Food was running out. The once mighty Gallic warriors now faced a slow and agonizing death, not by Roman swords, but by starvation. Desperate, Vercingetorix made a ruthless decision. He expelled thousands of civilians, women, children, the elderly, out of the city to conserve supplies for his fighters. But Caesar was merciless. He refused to let them pass through his fortifications. Between the walls of Rome and the gates of Alesia, the innocent were left to die. But Vercingetorix had one final hope: reinforcements. The message had been sent, and soon a massive Gallic relief army arrived. Estimates range from 120,000 to 250,000 warriors, dwarfing Caesar's 60,000 men. The siege had now flipped. Caesar was the one surrounded. Inside, Vercingetorix's warriors prepared for a final breakout. Outside, the relief force got into position. The Romans were now caught between two armies, outnumbered nearly 4-1. Then on a fateful day, the Gauls launched a massive, coordinated assault, a two-pronged attack from both inside and out. If Caesar's lines broke, the Romans would be slaughtered. The Battle of Alesia was about to reach its climax. The ground shook as the Gallic relief army charged, slamming into Caesar's outer defenses. At the same time, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's warriors erupted from the city gates, launching a desperate breakout attempt. For the first time, the Romans were completely overwhelmed. The outer wall buckled under the sheer force of the Gallic assault. At one weak point, near a marsh, the relief army broke through, sending waves of warriors surging into the Roman lines. If they succeeded in widening the gap, the battle and the war would be over. Caesar knew this was the moment of truth. Dressed in his famous red cloak, he personally led his troops into battle. Fighting side by side with his men, he rallied his legions for one final stand. Then, in a brilliant tactical move, Caesar unleashed his cavalry, sweeping around the Gauls' exposed flank. The relief force, caught between the Roman cavalry and the fortified walls, collapsed into chaos. One by one, the Gallic warriors fell. The massive army that came to save Alesia routed. Inside the city, Vercingetorix watched in horror. His last hope was gone. The battle was lost. The next day, he surrendered. With his forces annihilated and no escape left, Vercingetorix had no choice. In a dramatic moment, he rode into Caesar's camp, removed his armor, and knelt before his conqueror. The once mighty leader of the Gauls was now a prisoner. He would be taken to Rome, paraded in Caesar's triumph, and later executed. The victory at Alesia marked the end of Gallic resistance. Gaul became firmly under Roman control, bringing wealth, power, and prestige to Caesar. But this victory did more than secure Gaul. It propelled Caesar toward ultimate power. The man who won Alesia would soon march on Rome itself. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's greatest battles, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more epic stories of strategy, power, and conquest. On March 15th, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, conqueror, and visionary, was brutally stabbed to death by a group of senators. They called themselves the Liberators, believing they were freeing Rome from tyranny. But instead of restoring democracy, they unleashed a storm that would consume the Republic forever. What happened immediately after Caesar fell? Who stepped into the power vacuum? And how did the murder of one man lead to the rise of the most powerful empire in history? As Caesar's lifeless body lay on the Senate floor, Rome descended into chaos. His closest allies, including Mark Antony and a young, unknown heir named Octavian, were about to turn Caesar's death into an opportunity for absolute power. Rather than saving the Republic, the assassination of Julius Caesar ignited a brutal struggle for dominance, one that would end in the birth of an empire. The senators expected celebrations after Caesar's death. Instead, they were met with silence and fear. As his bloodied body lay abandoned on the Senate floor, the so-called liberators, Brutus, Cassius, and their allies, marched through the streets declaring they had saved the Republic. But instead of cheering crowds, they found a city in shock. The people of Rome loved Caesar. He had given them land, food, and stability. Now their leader was dead, and the streets erupted into chaos. Sensing danger, Brutus and Cassius fled to the Capitoline Hill, hoping to rally support. Meanwhile, one man seized the moment. Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general. Antony secured Caesar's money, political power, and will, making himself the most influential man in Rome. But his true masterstroke? Caesar's funeral. Before the entire city, Antony delivered a speech so powerful, it turned the Roman people into a raging mob, one that would burn the assassins' hopes to the ground. At first, the Senate tried to keep the peace. They declared an amnesty for the assassins, hoping to prevent civil war. But Mark Antony had other plans. Caesar's funeral was the turning point. In front of a massive crowd, Antony read Caesar's will, revealing that he had left money and land to the Roman people. Then, in a moment of raw emotion, he unveiled Caesar's blood-stained toga, pointing at his wounds and naming the men who had betrayed him. The reaction? Absolute fury. The people rioted, burning down the homes of the assassins. Brutus and Cassius, now public enemies, fled Rome, knowing their time was running out. Meanwhile, another key player entered the scene, Gaius Octavius, better known as Octavian. Just 19 years old, he was named Caesar's heir in the will. Many dismissed him as weak, but Octavian was calculating, ruthless, and dangerously ambitious. Realizing they had common enemies, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE. Together, they hunted down their enemies, unleashing a wave of executions, including the famous orator Cicero. With their power secured, there was only one thing left to do: eliminate Brutus and Cassius once and for all. Brutus and Cassius had escaped, but they weren't finished yet. They had fled to the eastern provinces, gathering a massive army to challenge the Second Triumvirate. By 42 BCE, the final showdown was set, the Battle of Philippi. On one side, Brutus and Cassius, leading over 100,000 troops, determined to restore the Republic. On the other, Antony and Octavian, commanding an equally massive force, fighting to avenge Caesar. The first clash was brutal. Cassius, misled by false reports that his army had lost, took his own life. With his co-leader gone, Brutus pressed on, but his forces were pushed back and overwhelmed in a second decisive battle. Seeing no escape, Brutus fell on his own sword, his final words allegedly being, "O wretched virtue, thou wast but a name." With their enemies dead, Antony and Octavian stood victorious. The Republic was now in their hands. But peace would not last. The two men who fought together would soon become bitter rivals, leading Rome into another bloody conflict, one that would determine the future of the empire. With Brutus and Cassius dead, the Republic was gone. But the power struggle had only just begun. The Second Triumvirate was unstable from the start. Lepidus was quickly sidelined, leaving only two men vying for control, Mark Antony and Octavian. At first, they divided the empire. Antony ruled the east, while Octavian controlled the west. But tension grew, and soon the alliance collapsed into open hostility. Antony made a fateful mistake. He fell under the spell of Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Their romance wasn't just personal, it was political. Antony aligned himself with Egyptian wealth and power, presenting himself as a king rather than a Roman statesman. Octavian seized this opportunity. Using propaganda, he painted Antony as a traitor, claiming he wanted to make Egypt the center of Rome's empire. The Senate, stirred by Octavian's rhetoric, declared war on Cleopatra, and by extension, Antony. The final battle came in 31 BCE at Actium. Octavian's navy, led by the brilliant Marcus Agrippa, crushed Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. Defeated, humiliated, and abandoned, Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where they took their own lives rather than face capture. Now only one man remained standing. Octavian had won. The Republic was dead. An empire was about to rise. With Antony and Cleopatra dead, Octavian was now the undisputed ruler of Rome. There was no one left to challenge him. In 27 BCE, he made a calculated move. Rather than declaring himself a dictator like Caesar, he claimed to restore the Republic. In reality, he consolidated absolute power and was given a new title, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The Republic was no more. In its place stood an empire that would last for over 1,500 years. Ironically, the men who killed Caesar to save Rome had done the opposite. Their actions paved the way for one-man rule forever. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the chaos after Caesar's assassination, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more thrilling stories from history. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Empires are not immortal. They rise and they fall. Rome did not collapse overnight. It did not crumble in a single battle or a single event. Instead, its fall was slow, agonizing, an empire consumed from within. Heavy taxes crushed the poor. Crops withered in neglected fields. The people starved while corrupt politicians gorged themselves on power. And as Rome's armies turned against each other, the empire rotted from the inside out. This is the story of how the world's greatest empire fell. The story of Rome's decline. At its height, Rome was a city of marble, gold, and endless feasts. But behind the grandeur, cracks were forming. The empire's economy was rotting. Taxation was suffocating the people. Rome's vast armies, its palaces, its conquests, they all came at a cost. And that cost was paid by the poor. Farmers, once the backbone of Rome's economy, were crushed by impossible taxes. Many abandoned their lands, leaving once thriving farms to decay. The empire, desperate for food, turned to imported grain, relying more and more on provinces that no longer wanted to be ruled. And then there was Rome's greatest weakness, slavery. For centuries, Rome had been built on the backs of enslaved people, captured in war and forced to work the fields, build the cities, and serve the elite. But as Rome's conquests slowed, so did the supply of slaves. Without them, the economy sputtered. Fields went unplowed, production slowed, trade declined. Then came the plagues. Sweeping through the empire, disease and famine struck with brutal force. Entire towns were left empty. Rome's once thriving streets filled with the sick and the dead. The population plummeted, and with fewer workers, the empire's economy fell into freefall. By the 3rd century AD, Rome was a shadow of its former self, an empire too large to sustain, too broken to repair. But economic ruin was only part of the story. the empire was also falling apart from within. The emperors, once symbols of strength, had become weak, incompetent, and corrupt. Some were mere puppets, controlled by the army. Others were more interested in luxury than leadership. Some lasted only months before they were assassinated, overthrown, or simply disappeared. Between 235 and 285 AD, Rome had nearly 50 emperors, most of whom met violent ends. Civil war became a way of life. Generals fought for the throne, leading their armies against each other while Rome's real enemies gathered at the borders. And then there was the bureaucracy, a bloated, inefficient beast that strangled the empire in red tape. Laws were ignored, officials were bribed, and the people had no trust in their government. Rome was no longer ruled, it was simply surviving. By the 4th century, Rome was in free fall. The economy had collapsed. The people were starving. The government was broken. The empire had once been unstoppable, but now it was rotting from within, a crumbling giant waiting to fall. And when the final blow came, when Rome's enemies marched through its gates, it was not a mighty empire that stood against them. It was a weakened, fractured state, already defeated by its own corruption. This was the fall of Rome. This was the end of an empire. Empires do not fall in a single day. They do not collapse in one battle or crumble with one bad ruler. They rot from within. Once Rome's legions were Rome itself, loyal citizen soldiers willing to die for the Republic. But as the empire expanded, that loyalty faded. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Rome's armies were filled not with Romans, but with foreign mercenaries, Germanic warriors, Huns, and other so-called barbarians. These men fought for gold, not for Rome. And when the gold stopped flowing, so did their loyalty. Emperors relied on tribal leaders to supply troops, giving these outsiders military power within Rome itself. In many cases, these so-called allies turned against their Roman masters. The empire had armed its own destroyers. One of the most infamous betrayals came in 378 AD, when a Roman emperor allowed tens of thousands of Gothic mercenaries to settle within Roman lands. When these Goths were mistreated, they rebelled, and at the Battle of Adrianople, the Roman army suffered a catastrophic defeat. The emperor himself was killed, and Rome's invincibility was shattered. Rome was no longer feared, it was hunted. And then, the floodgates opened. From the east came the Huns, led by the ruthless Attila, a warlord who struck fear into both Romans and barbarians alike. His warriors rode fast, burned cities, and demanded tribute. Rome paid them in gold, hoping to buy peace. But peace never lasts. Meanwhile, in the west, other enemies were watching. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, marched into Rome itself, the heart of the empire. They looted, burned, and humiliated a city that had once been the symbol of power. For the first time in 800 years, Rome had fallen to an enemy's sword, and it would not be the last time. In 455 AD, the Vandals, fierce warriors from North Africa, sacked Rome again, taking whatever the Goths had left behind. The empire was bleeding, dying from both within and without. By 476 AD, the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown by a Germanic warlord. The Western Roman Empire, the empire that had ruled the known world for centuries, was no more. Rome was not destroyed in a single battle. It fell piece by piece, weakened by overexpansion, betrayed by its own mercenaries, and shattered by the relentless waves of barbarian invasions. It had grown too large, too complacent, too dependent on outsiders to fight its wars. It is a lesson history teaches again and again. No empire, no matter how powerful, can stand forever. And so, the empire that once ruled the world became nothing more than ruins. whispers of a past that would never return. Rome was more than just a city. It was an idea, a civilization that seemed invincible. But empires do not last forever. In the 5th century, the unthinkable happened. The Eternal City, once the unchallenged ruler of the Mediterranean, was attacked. Not once, but twice. The year is 410 CE. Rome is a shadow of its former glory. The empire, once a unified superpower, is now split, east and west, with the Western Roman Empire growing weaker by the day. On the frontiers, Germanic tribes, once Rome's enemies, then its allies, are growing restless. One tribe, the Visigoths, has been pushed to the brink. Their leader, Alaric I. A brilliant and determined warrior, Alaric had once fought for Rome. But now, betrayed and ignored by Roman leaders, he seeks justice through fire and steel. For years, Alaric and his Visigothic warriors have marched across Italy, demanding land, gold, and security. Rome refuses. And so, Alaric makes a decision that will shake the world. He marches on Rome itself. August 24th, 410 CE. The gates of Rome are thrown open. The Visigoths flood inside. The city is defenseless. No legions stand to protect it. The once mighty capital of the empire is at the mercy of foreign invaders. For 3 days, Rome is consumed by chaos. The Visigoths loot the grand palaces of senators, tear through the forum, and rip apart the ancient temples. But this is not mindless destruction. Alaric, though furious at Rome's betrayal, does not seek to burn it to the ground. He orders his men to spare churches, protect religious relics, and avoid excessive bloodshed. Still, for the Romans, the horror is unimaginable. The city that once ruled the world is now the victim of war. When Alaric finally leads his army away, Rome is left scarred, humiliated, and forever changed. The message is clear. The empire is no longer untouchable. Rome survives the Visigoths, but it is wounded, and the wounds do not heal. Decades later, in 455 CE, a new enemy sets its sights on the Eternal City. The Vandals, a Germanic tribe that has carved out a kingdom in North Africa, now threaten Rome's fragile empire. Their leader, King Genseric, is ambitious, ruthless, and ready to strike. Rome, politically unstable and militarily weak, is in no condition to resist. The ruling emperor, Petronius Maximus, tries to flee, but he is caught and stoned to death by his own people. The city is leaderless, the gates are open, and the Vandals march in. Unlike Alaric's Visigoths, the Vandals show no restraint. They pillage the city for 2 full weeks. Art, gold, and priceless treasures are ripped from palaces and shipped back to Africa. The mighty bronze roof of the Temple of Jupiter is torn away. Even the sacred places are not spared. The Vandals strip St. Peter's Basilica of its riches, looting Rome's greatest symbols of faith. The city is humiliated, its wealth gone. Unlike the Visigoths, the Vandals leave nothing behind. They do not conquer Rome, they gut it. And when they finally leave, they take more than gold. They take thousands of Roman citizens as slaves. Rome, once the master of nations, is now at the mercy of foreign kings. No empire, no matter how mighty, lasts forever. In the 4th century, something changed. A new faith, once scorned and persecuted, rose from the shadows. Christianity. Once the religion of outcasts and martyrs, Christianity would become the beating heart of a transformed empire. The temples of Jupiter and Apollo would crumble, replaced by churches and cathedrals. The legions, once sworn to the old gods, would march under the sign of the cross. And at the center of it, all stood one man, Constantine the Great. This is the story of Rome's greatest transformation. In the early days of Rome, religion was everywhere. Gods and goddesses shaped every aspect of life. Offerings were made before battles. Prayers were whispered in bustling marketplaces. Grand temples loomed over the cities. But as the empire expanded, cracks began to form. The old gods seemed distant, their temples rich but hollow. And in the back streets of cities like Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome itself, a new faith was growing. Christianity. It was unlike anything Rome had seen before. It spoke of one God, not many, of humility, not power, of love and forgiveness, not conquest. And it terrified Rome's rulers. For centuries, emperors saw Christianity as a threat. Christians were hunted, arrested, and executed in brutal spectacles, thrown to wild beasts in the Colosseum, burned alive in Nero's gardens, tortured in the dungeons of Rome. And yet, they did not break. Even in the face of death, their numbers grew. And then, everything changed. The year was 312 AD. The Roman world was torn by civil war, as rival generals fought for control of the empire. Among them was Constantine, a battle-hardened leader marching toward the Tiber River, preparing for war against his greatest rival, Maxentius. On the eve of battle, Constantine looked to the sky and saw a vision that would change history, a blazing cross, and beneath it, the words, "In this sign, conquer." The next day, Constantine's army rode into battle with the Christian symbol, the Chi Rho, painted on their shields. Against overwhelming odds, they emerged victorious. Constantine was now the undisputed ruler of Rome, and his victory convinced him of one thing: the Christian God was real. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, ending centuries of Christian persecution and granting freedom of worship across the empire. For the first time, Christianity was not just tolerated, it was protected, and soon it would become Rome's most powerful institution. But Christianity's rise was not faith, it was about power. Constantine saw the church as more than just a religion. It was a unifying force, something that could stabilize a crumbling empire. He built grand churches, the Basilica of St. Peter, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He called bishops to the Council of Nicaea to settle theological disputes, shaping Christian doctrine itself. And as Rome's emperors faded, the church remained. While the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, the church endured. Latin, Roman law, and even imperial traditions lived on, not through emperors, but through bishops and popes. The Vatican became the new Rome. The Pope took the place of the emperor, and the legacy of Rome, once written in the laws of Caesars, was now carried in the pages of the Bible. Rome had not truly fallen. It had simply transformed. Rome was once a city of pagan gods, mighty legions, and emperors who claimed divinity. But today, it is the heart of Christianity. The old temples are ruins. The Colosseum no longer echoes with the cries of martyrs. And yet, the legacy of the empire lives on, not through soldiers and conquests, but through faith, tradition, and the power of the church. Constantine's vision, a cross in the sky, a faith victorious, became the future of Rome. An empire of war had become an empire of faith. Don't miss out. If you love our epic content, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. In 476 AD, the great city of Rome fell to barbarian invaders. The Western Roman Empire was no more. And yet, the empire itself did not die. To the east, beyond the crumbling ruins of Rome, the flame of civilization still burned. From the mighty walls of Constantinople, a new Rome endured, one that would stand for 1,000 more years. It was an empire of emperors and intrigue, of warriors and scholars, of faith and ambition, It was the Byzantine Empire. But survival came at a cost. The Byzantines faced sieges, betrayals, plagues, and endless wars. They stood against Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and the relentless might of the Ottoman Turks. So how did they endure when so many other empires crumbled? This is the story of the empire that refused to fall. Our story begins in the year 330 AD, when Emperor Constantine the Great made a fateful decision. He looked upon the city of Byzantium, an ancient Greek settlement at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and saw its potential. Here, at the edge of the Bosporus, he built a new capital, a city greater than Rome itself. He named it Constantinople. With mighty walls and a commanding position over trade routes, Constantinople became the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. But for centuries, Rome remained the empire's center, until 476 AD, when the Western Roman Empire fell. With the fall of Rome, Constantinople stood alone. To the west lay chaos, barbarian kingdoms rising from the ruins of Rome. To the east, the powerful Persian Empire eyed Byzantium with growing hostility. Yet, against all odds, the Eastern Roman Empire survived, and over time it became something new, a fusion of Roman governance, Greek culture, and Christian faith. It became Byzantium. One man would come closer than any other to restoring Rome's lost glory, Justinian I. Rising to power in 527 AD, Justinian had a vision: to rebuild the Roman Empire. And with his brilliant general Belisarius, he launched an ambitious campaign to reclaim lost lands. From the shattered ruins of the Western Roman Empire, Justinian took back North Africa from the Vandals. He reconquered Italy, bringing Rome itself back under imperial rule. But Justinian's ambition went beyond conquest. He built the Hagia Sophia, a breathtaking church that still stands today. He created Justinian's Code, a legal system that shaped European law for centuries. Yet his reign was far from easy. The plague of Justinian swept through the empire, killing millions, including his own soldiers. Wars drained the treasury, and when Justinian died in 565 AD, his dream of a reunited empire died with him. But Byzantium would endure. By the 7th century, Byzantium was no longer a Roman empire in name alone. It was Greek in language, Christian in faith, and Byzantine in spirit. But enemies closed in from every side. To the east, the Arab Caliphate emerged, sweeping through Persia and into Byzantine lands. In 674 AD and again in 717 AD, Muslim forces besieged Constantinople itself. Yet, the city held firm, thanks to one secret weapon: Greek fire. A devastating liquid fire that burned even on water, Greek fire turned the tide of battle, saving Constantinople from conquest. Meanwhile, to the north, the Bulgars and Slavs pressed the empire's borders. But Byzantium adapted, forging alliances, building new armies, and even converting its enemies to Orthodox Christianity. For centuries, the empire survived by a delicate balance: military strength, diplomacy, and the sheer resilience of Constantinople. By the 10th century, Byzantium was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. Under emperors like Basil II, the empire expanded its borders once again. Trade flourished. The arts and sciences thrived. The empire's influence spread across the Christian world. For a moment it seemed as if Byzantium had regained its ancient strength. But danger lurked on the horizon. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Byzantine army suffered a catastrophic defeat against the Seljuk Turks. The empire's heartland in Anatolia was lost, and Byzantium was never the same again. A new enemy had arrived. Desperate for help, the Byzantine emperors called upon Christian Europe. The result? The First Crusade. But the Crusaders were not allies for long. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Western knights betrayed Byzantium. They stormed Constantinople, looting its treasures, destroying its monuments, and splitting the empire apart. Though Byzantium reclaimed Constantinople in 1261, it never recovered. Weakened, divided, and surrounded by enemies, it faced its greatest threat yet, the Ottoman Turks. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople. For 53 days, the city fought desperately, but on May 29, 1453, the walls were breached. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting as the city fell. After 1,123 years, the Eastern Roman Empire was no more. Though the empire fell, its influence never died. Byzantium preserved ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, shaping the Renaissance. Its Orthodox Christianity shaped Eastern Europe and Russia. Its laws, its art, its traditions all live on. For over 1,000 years, Byzantium stood between East and West, between ancient Rome and the modern world. It was the empire that refused to fall until it finally did. But its legacy? That will last forever. Rome was not always an empire. In the beginning, it was just a small city on the banks of the Tiber River. Legend tells of its founding in 753 BCE by Romulus and Remus, twin brothers raised by a she-wolf. But Rome's real story is one of ambition and warfare. First, Rome became a republic, a government unlike any the world had seen before. Power was not in the hands of a king, but shared among elected officials, senators, and generals. It was a system designed to prevent tyranny. Then came the wars, the conquest of Italy, the clash with Carthage, the struggle against Greece. Rome's legions were disciplined, fearless, and relentless. One by one, its enemies fell. By the time of Julius Caesar, Rome had expanded from Spain to Egypt, from Britain to the Middle East. Wealth poured into the city. Roads, aqueducts, and grand temples rose. The Republic had become a global superpower, but power breeds ambition, and ambition breeds conflict. Julius Caesar, Rome's greatest general, marched his army into Rome itself. He declared himself dictator, ending the Republic. He was assassinated by senators who feared he was becoming a king. But it was too late. The Republic was dead, and in its place, an empire was born. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, promised peace, and for 2 centuries, Rome thrived. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, saw the empire reach its peak. Trade flourished, cities grew, Roman law and engineering spread across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The empire was vast, but connected. The Colosseum hosted gladiator battles for crowds of 50,000. The Roman army, the most advanced in the world, ensured stability through strength. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The empire had grown too large. Corruption spread. Some emperors ruled wisely: Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus